Good afternoon and welcome to the second in a new series of seed sowing cross-disciplinary discussions. And today's topic is neuroscience and the perception of music. So I'm Carol Mason. I'm in the Zuckerman Institute. I'm a neuroscientist. And Chris Peacock, professor of philosophy and arts and sciences, and I are co-chairs of a committee we established for joint activities between Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Zuckerman and neuroscience more generally. So this event today was spurred by the Presidential Scholars in Society in Neuroscience, the PSSN program. And this program fosters communication and knowledge sharing between the arts, humanities, natural and social sciences, and established really at Columbia a new paradigm for interdisciplinary university-sponsored research. So it funds activities and also several postdoc fellows a year. And you'll hear from one of our scholars today, Mariusz Sachs. He's the first speaker. So when I joined the steering committee of PSSN, it was about the time that the Zuckerman Institute came together a few years ago. Chris approached me because he very much wanted to engage cross-disciplinary interaction discussion here at Columbia with all the range of issues about the mind, representation and explanation. This was the topic of the last seed sowing event. And so many other topics that cannot be possibly solved by one discipline alone. So we hope that get-togethers such as today's event will encourage you all to think about other activities we might have. And if you have suggestions, let us know. And we want to establish debate across all the campuses at Columbia, the Morningside campus, Manhattanville, and the Medical Center, between those who study the brain and those who wish to have an inroad to doing so. So the topics of today's meeting, as I said, is neuroscience and the perception of music. And we have 4 speakers. The first one will be Mariusz Sachs, who's a presidential scholar in Society of Neuroscience. He'll talk about neural and behavioral mechanisms involved in the emotions and feeling in response to music. Followed by Darcy Kelley, who's a professor of biological sciences, on how animals other than ourselves make and perceive music. Then we'll have Michael, or Mickey Goldberg, as he's known, who's in neuroscience, the Zuckerman Institute, also a neurologist. And he studies the psychophysics of physiology of vision, especially visual attention. Now, what does he have to say about music? He's a great lover, sponsor, and scholar of music. So he'll have some interesting things to say, I'm sure. And finally, we'll have Mariusz Kozak, who's professor of music. And he's going to talk about challenges that a humanistic perspective brings on music, from music to neuroscience. So the format is that we're going to have the 4 talks. They're each going to be short, 12 minutes each, hopefully. And you may ask questions in the chat box, and I'll ask them of the speakers after the talks. Then after the last question, any leftover questions will be raised, and we encourage all of you to stay around and ask questions of the speakers and of each other. So before beginning, though, I want to thank very much the PSSN staff, Joseph Sullick, who's Senior Project Manager, who's put this all together by Zoom, and Melinda Miller, who's Associate Director of the PSSN, but also especially Pamela Smith, who is Chair of the Presidential Scholars and also Director of the Center for Science and Society. And also to the Zuckerman, Rui Costa, of course, who is our Director, Kelley who's Director of Programs, and Natalie Trotta and Aaron Peterman, who have posted and advertised and helped with the organization. Hopefully we can, in the coming months, have this event in person in the Green Building, the Zuckerman Institute, where we could mingle in person. So without further ado, we'll have the first speaker. That's going to be Mariusz Sachs.
Thank you. Let me just share. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Chris and Carol and Joseph, Melinda, everyone for setting this up. I thought that a nice way to present on some of my work today would be to talk about a particular way in which neuroscientists and psychologists study the mind and the brain, and particularly the neuroscience of music. and something that I do a lot in my research. And I thought we could just sort of take an approach of where we talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this type of approach and certain concerns and considerations going forward. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term naturalistic paradigm, there's kind of been an increase in this term used particularly in neuroimaging in the last probably 10 to 15 years. There's even whole calls for papers specifically about naturalistic imaging. And there's even enough neuroimaging data and studies at this point that there's meta-analyses that have come out that look at and try to compare and combine results across different studies. And by naturalistic, typically what people mean is that they present stimuli unadulterated or unfiltered or uncut. And that is supposed to be more ecologically valid stimuli, and so more likely to mirror how we experience things in the everyday world, and therefore more likely to show us certain constructs or behaviors or activities that might be hard to study in the lab. But I want to break down what we really mean when we say naturalistic stimuli, particularly in terms of music. So the gamut of neuroimaging studies have used tons of different musical stimuli to study different mechanisms in the brain. And you can think about them on a continuum of the kind of low-level non-naturalistic, where we have high experimenter control. That might be something like sine tones, so just playing people basically pitches without any timbre to them. And then another extreme of that, we have neuroimaging studies where people listen to full-length symphonies. And that would be on this other end here of very naturalistic in the sense that they are not manipulated at all, and low experimental control. And there's studies that have used, so going up this kind of like hierarchy here, we have monophonic clips of, for example, a piano melody, to actual Billboard top 40 hits, but just excerpts of them, to full-length pieces of music, and then up to potentially performing or listening with another person, which may be kind of the most ecologically valid we could think of. I'm going to put an asterisk there because we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So the term naturalistic might be somewhat misleading for some of you, because for many of you might be thinking, well, there's nothing really naturalistic about the experience of listening to music inside of a neuroimaging scanner. And for that, you are right. And so let's just clarify what we mean by naturalistic and what the advantages are of using, let's say, full-length pieces or uncut or unmanipulated pieces of music. So if we replace that term naturalistic with realistic, for example, what this allows us is to study certain phenomena that are going to be very difficult to study when you have a static image or a sine tone or something that's very, very highly controlled. So anything sort of dynamic, highly social, highly rewarding and emotional, these are complex states that are going to be very difficult to really get at in an ecologically valid way during neuroimaging unless you use something that has a temporal component or that has multiple individuals or different social aspects to it. So it allows us to study complex multivariate mental processes and any sort of temporal change, right? So if we're thinking about just like a single tone, it's going to be hard to assess the meaning of the dynamics of brain activity, for example, since we don't have any temporal component there. The non-naturalistic, so these are components of music listening that is not quote unquote naturalistic. So we may think that it's good for all these things, but there are certain things to keep in mind when we call something naturalistic. So most of the time, the musical stimuli we're using are a form of media, and they need to be thought of in that way, meaning that it is not, if we're going to study auditory processing, or we're going to study reward, or we're going to study emotions with music, keeping in mind that the music is often a form of media, a form of entertainment, is important for understanding the psychological mechanisms that are involved in there. Kind of relatedly to these two things is the fact that music is an aesthetic experience. I can also say vicarious, and by that I mean you're not actually experiencing the emotions of the person or the character or the performer, but you're sort of vicariously experiencing them along with them. So there's a level of abstraction there that we need to keep in mind when we talk about naturalistic music stimuli in neuroimaging. And then there are certain just disadvantages with using kind of low experimenter controlled stimuli, which is potential confounds with lower level acoustic features, which might be conflated with the kind of construct that you're interested in. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then just without this kind of control as to what we're actually looking at, or like if we're talking about polyphonic music, it could become potentially difficult to interpret the results. So I'm going to talk about three different, maybe two if I only have time for it, but two different mechanisms that we can study with music and the ways that we can talk about using naturalistic versus non-naturalistic music to both get at these two questions and kind of compare and contrast what we can learn from them. So the first one is kind of near and dear to my heart. It's a lot of what I do, and that's the study of emotions. There's a couple different models by which music can evoke emotions. One particular one that I like that's pretty probably overly simplistic, but nice for demonstrating my point, which is that there are multiple different mechanisms by which a piece of music can convey and evoke an emotion. You can think of something like emotional resonance. So if a piece evokes qualities that you associate with the experience of sadness, you may then feel sad. On the other hand, if it is something objectively beautiful about the sounds, the way they're being played, that can evoke feelings of enjoyment. And these mechanisms can kind of work on their own. And then you can also sort of think about them on this kind of time scale of faster to slower. So things like a clap or a bang would evoke a brainstem reflex, which might be arousing or anxiety provoking, where something like enjoyment is probably going to happen on a longer time scale. So this is just one way in which we can study different mechanisms of musical activity by using different types of stimuli, for example, the naturalistic and the non-naturalistic. So I'll give two examples from my own work. If we want to talk about kind of like these lower level, faster responses, one of my early studies was to look at emotional responses to different sound clips. So we played participants in the scanner these very, very short clips of music that were designed to convey an emotion. So that was violin conveying really, really quickly happy. And then we also had vocal sounds doing the exact same thing. So that would be a vocal sound of sadness. And the goal was to look basically across all sounds. Where do we find predictive information for the emotion that's being conveyed independent of the sound source? And mostly what we found was that the regions were most predictive of the emotion, independent of whether or not it was the violin, the clarinet, or the human voice, which all are acoustically very different, was mostly in the temporal lobe, the sort of like sensory processing regions of the brain, and not much in the higher level cortical regions of the brain that we know are involved in kind of like enjoyment or the changing emotional states. And so what we're really studying here, I think, is the perception of sound quality. And one difficulty with studying emotions, and particularly with music, is this question of how do we disentangle the lower level acoustic features from what is actual emotion? And the answer really is that you cannot ever really separate these lower level acoustic features from the emotions that one is experiencing. But with something like this, we can try to run models with including certain acoustic features in there and without, and basically see how much our accuracy on when emotion was being conveyed drops when you take out or include certain acoustic features. And this is one way that we can use, this is what we're showing here is using very unnaturalistic musical stimuli to get at one aspect of emotional experience, which is the perception of sounds, of the emotions of sounds. Whoops, there we go. Taking this up another level, so that's again, we're mostly seeing sensory regions of the brain, and I think many of us would argue that we're not really looking at complex emotional states like pleasurable sadness or nostalgia with those short little annoying clips. So if you really want to study something that's more temporal, that's more complex, I think this is where we start needing something that is much more naturalistic. And now we have this problem of how do we control for lower level acoustic features if we're going to play people a whole symphony or a long piece of music. And so something I've been working on as a PSN scholar in my postdoc is to actually have composers write us a full piece of music in which we can control those the instruments that are used and the tempo that are used and make sure they're not conflated with the emotions that are being experienced. So that's exactly what we've done. And we have clips of these now where a composer basically wrote us, actually 3 composers wrote us a 15-minute piece of music that naturally transitions between these different emotional states that we gave them using always the same 4 instruments and the same tempo. So I'll give you an example of one of the clips that the composers have written. This is not the transition. This is just one kind of like part of the piece, just to save time. So the idea with this study is that we'll have these different motifs or musical events that convey different emotions that are changing over time. And this will allow us to look at sort of higher patterns of spatiotemporal activity that might be mapping onto these more, I would say, ecologically valid emotional experiences with music. And because, you know, we have much more complex information, we're still we're gonna have to apply different ways of disentangling acoustic features from emotional features. And one way we can do this is by building these models to predict the signal of brain activity, where we include various acoustic features, include emotion features, and then basically compare models for how well we can predict left out or held out brain data based on, is this brain activity basically most driven by the acoustic information or the emotional features or some combination of the two. So that would sort of be the goal with this, which is a way in which we can use naturalistic stimuli and still get a sense of what's driving the brain activity. Is it the acoustics or the emotion or some combination of them? So I'm running out of time, and I will actually skip to my last slide, which is basically how some of these studies can be informed by sort of cross-disciplinary research. So even in my short time here, I've had conversations with people with different professors in humanities, and we've discussed different ways and different things to think about when you do these types of naturalistic paradigms with music. One is that I've actually met with and talked with media scholars, music theorists, and composers. Obviously, I've worked with those. Media scholars is actually a very important, the way in which the music was written and the intentions of the composer and the lower level features, which I'm sort of calling and assuming here are confounding variables, actually are very much features and components of the ways in which composers and filmmakers or anyone who sort of creates art are trying to drive and manipulate emotions. So keeping that in mind and being aware of what features are being used is important in this type of research going forward. There's also the question I've always been asked is, you know, music listening is so much, and the emotions that are evoked by music listening is so much of a shared experience or a social experience. So in what ways can we sort of try to incorporate that into neuroimaging? I didn't have a chance to talk about things like hyperscanning, which is where you have two people or more than one people having synchronously experiencing something and then recording brain activity at the same time, which is one way we can start doing this. Another would be something like a virtual reality system where people are believing or feeling like they're in a concert hall or with other people. And then the last group of people that I think it's been important to collaborate with and talk with, especially with the understanding of emotions and what they are philosophers. And even my short time here talking with Chris about what is an aesthetic experience and the different ways that emotions relate to qualia and the experience of emotion can be understood in philosophy, then informs how we kind of ask the questions and guides the research going forward. So I will stop there. And then do we take questions now or?
Sure, we can take questions now. Anyone want to raise a question or raise your hand or type in the chat box? I'll ask one. I thought media scholars is an interesting category. Do we have any at Columbia? And what do they study specifically? Do you know?
I actually don't know if we have any at Columbia. I interacted with someone at Dartmouth just last week, actually, and I'm meeting with her in a couple of days, who is a media scholar who studies the neuroscience of film. And she was very just kind of opened my eyes to the ways in which like a media scholar would think about like cuts in a piece in a film or something, and how the lighting and the camera angle, everything is an abstraction of reality, and that's something that needs to be included in any sort of neuroscience study of an underlying component that you think you're trying to study. So I don't know actually, but that's something I want to look at.
Cool. There is a question.
I see one question.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to read it?
Sure.
It's from Adele Everland. Yeah.
Yes. So when you say that the composers you've commissioned have written music with specific emotions, how subjective could that judgment be? Yeah, it is totally subjective, 100%. So we're not going to, well, one thing is I think that's slightly better than we can do otherwise, because we now know the intention of the composer, whereas normally we wouldn't even know that intention if we're using a commercial piece of music. On the other hand, we also are asking people, so before we do any sort of neuroimaging, we will play these clips for people and get crowdsourced answers to what people are experiencing while they're listening to them, so that we have a general sense of what is obviously not objective, but like a agreed upon emotion. And then anyone who comes in to do the scanning will also give us their subjective ratings. So we can use all these different information when we build the models of the brain.
Great. Just one last question, and we could ask other ones at the end of the session. So this is from Anuruddha Das, a naive question. Aren't emotions evoked by music culturally determined? Like broadly Western classical music obviously means something different or North Indian classical means something different to the American music.
Right, so someone answered that question, but I would say something similar, which is yes and no. There are for sure cross-cultural differences, but there's also evidence that for simpler melodies, the ability to determine what emotion they think is trying to be conveyed is relatively universal. So there's studies with Western listeners listening to West African music that they're not familiar with, and they're pretty reliably able to determine the emotion that is conveyed or is understood when West African listeners listen to that music, and vice versa.
Yeah, good. Well, perhaps you can stop screen sharing, and sure. Darcy's going to be next, but she also pointed out that Isabel Peretz, no, I can't read my chat, has shown there's a quite high concordance for some pieces, simpler ones, that it's also cross-cultural. So we can come back to that at the end, maybe. So now next is Darcy Kelley, who will talk about humans and animals.
Thanks very much for organizing this. It's always fun to talk about music and sound in the brain. I'm a biologist, and as a biologist, I'm interested in cross-species comparisons of music. And I'm also deeply interested in the question of where music comes from. So you have illustrations here of human species. We have a piece of classical music with two musical instruments. So I like this clip as an illustration of what I'm going to talk about, because it has features that are very important, not just for music, but for vocal communication. So you have the human voice as an instrument, which is, of course, also capable of expressing musical qualities through song. And then you have instrumental music in the background. And music has fascinated biologists and psychologists for a long period of time. And it was also fascinating to Charles Darwin. Somehow my screen, well, perhaps we can go on to the next one. There we go. As neither the enjoyment nor the capacity of producing musical notes are faculties of the least direct use to man in reference to his ordinary habits of life, they must be ranked among the most mysterious with which he is endowed. And up there among those other qualities is language, of course. And so this has been the subject of a great deal of argument in the literature about the origins of music. Ranging from Steven Pinker, with whom you're probably all familiar. So Pinker thought that music was just a sort of involuntary byproduct of the development of language. And the image that he used was the spandrel, which are these spaces between the arches, which you can see here, that come along with the formation of an arch, but are not integral to the arch itself, except as being created by its presence. And a viewpoint with which I have to say I'm more sympathetic is put forward by the evolutionary psychologist Geoffrey Miller, who thought that language actually evolved from music as opposed to vice versa. And the reason I've always liked this is because it occurred to me that, it was dark at least 12 hours a day in those caves, and there was a lot to be done vocally to amuse oneself. it's perfectly possible that music and the use of instruments either coexisted with or predated the existence of language. But of course, human beings are not the only species that produce music. We all, particularly during the pandemic, have noted the songs of birds. And this is one of the ones that I studied as a postdoctoral fellow. So that's the song of a canary. And actually, it's interesting that wild canaries don't sing quite so euphoniously, but they also don't sing quite so loudly. And that's because many of the strains of canaries that we have nowadays were selected to be deaf, so that they had to sing loudly to hear their own song. The Wasserschlager strain in particular was selected in that way. There's a big argument in the literature, in the animal behavior literature, about whether animals that produce sounds that sound musical to us utilize or capitalize or appreciate those musical qualities in their own sounds. And it's the pendulum kind of swings back and forth. There's a literature in birds that says that if they have a choice of notes, they don't particularly choose notes that would be harmonic in the Western classical scale. And then there are other literatures that say, no, the musical quality of songs is quite marked. And it would be helpful, I think, to be able to study these issues in a whole range of species, many of which use sounds in their communication. And we actually study it in a species that lives in this environment. So this is a town near Cape Town in South Africa. And this here is actually an artificial pond in the pool of a vineyard. And that vineyard is inhabited by these animals here. This is a frog, Xenopus laevis. And these frogs also produce music, but it would be unlikely that you would ever hear it because they have evolved a mechanism to produce sounds, a entirely new way of producing sounds underwater. And we've known this for a long time, but it took a student in the lab, Ursula Kwong Brown, who's shown up here at the upper right, to discover the intrinsic musical qualities of their songs. And I think you'll be able to appreciate it when I play this. So first you're going to hear the mating call of a particular species of Xenopus itambuensis, and then you're going to hear a rendition of that song transposed to the piano. This works. So one day, Ursula, who was actually a music and biology major, looked up from her desk in the lab and said, "Why is that frog singing a perfect fourth?" And we spent then the next quite a few years figuring out exactly how that perfect fourth was created within the musical instrument of the frog, which is the frog's larynx, his voice box. And in doing so, we discovered this new way of producing sound. So this quality of producing sound that have what sound like musical qualities to us is really actually quite frequent in the musical world. It's usually created by the movement of air across membranes that vibrate. But in Xenopus, there are no membranes that vibrate. They've had to create a whole new way while retaining that particular musical quality. So I'd like to speak in just the final few moments of these remarks. There's a lot more that I could say, but this is, I think, very important about where these aspects of music that we recognize as emotion, where they are processed within the nervous system. And you've already seen a preview of that and the sensory structures within the cortex, for example, that were in the human cortex that respond to music. But the emotional qualities of music are very, very well known to involve another and much more ancient part of the brain, which is shown here in pink. And that is a structure called the amygdala. And so I'm going to now subject you to an experiment in which your amygdala is going to be specifically activated. And this could also be activated by a piece of music, but this particular piece of human music is especially powerful. And I have truncated it so you don't have to listen to the entire thing. So it turns out that if you do neuroimaging on people, that this ancient region of the brain, the amygdala, lights up. And in experimental animals where we have very high resolution, we can see that it's one particular part of the amygdala called the central nucleus of the amygdala that has long been known to control things that are affected by emotion, such as heart rate and breathing. So there is an ancient system in the brain present all the way from frogs to man that is capable of converting sounds into a powerful emotion. And this is very important for our social life as well. And it turns out that women who have had children are particularly prone to have their amygdalas light up in response to a baby's cry. And I am going to stop sharing and take questions. If I can get the screen out of this. Exit.
Yeah.
Stop share. There we go.
Great. Any questions people want to write in to the chat box?
Mike, I know, Shadlin, I know you're there. I saw your name. And Claire.
Is the central nucleus of the amygdala, is there an equivalent structure in frog? And is it relatively, does it occupy the same real estate that human amygdala does, for example?
Yeah, the frog has a central amygdala. The advances in molecular biology that allow us to look at transcription factor expression have clearly shown that. And it's directly homologous. And if you damage the amygdala in a male frog, he can no longer respond in a socially appropriate way to the calls of female frogs.
And that answers in part Chris Peacock's question, which is, can you say something about the social role of music production in those frogs in their life, social or otherwise?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because so each of these species of frogs produces notes that have these two frequencies that are in harmonic ratios in the Western classical scale. And so we went in and started to manipulate these in females. And we have a big collection of species and we didn't want to hurt them. So we used a method that people use for babies to see if they can hear. It's called the auditory brainstem response, or it's an auditory evoked potential. And what we discovered was that females were incredibly much more sensitive to their own species ratio, but only if the notes were, the frequencies that comprise the ratio were the correct ones for that species. So they didn't really have an abstract appreciation of the musical quality where it wouldn't, an octave, you'd recognize an octave at point in the piano, but that had to also have the correct pitch. And they could hear a sound much further away with the correct frequencies. And that, as it turns out, is true only of females. That's not true of males. And it's hormone sensitive, so that the hormone that they put out when they're in reproductive condition stimulates the actual neurons that respond to the sound, the auditory neurons, and they are more sensitive.
Yeah. So now there's a multitude of questions. Does the rhythm of the frog song, this is from Ulkar Ageva, does the rhythm of the frog song carry information? How sparse are their calls? Well, I guess it depends on the...
So there are three major rhythms in the frog-called world in this particular group. There are single pulses, there are short bursts of pulses, and then there are trills that sound like arr, 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 like that. And those rhythms are distributed over the entire phylogeny of the group. So if you look at any group of closely related frogs, genetically closely related, some will have one temporal rhythm and some will have another. And the temporal rhythm is determined by a circuit at the back of the brain and the hindbrain. That's the same circuit that is used for breathing, except of course that these frogs aren't breathing while they're underwater or they would drown. And so that circuitry is different, and there's a particular kind of neuron in one part of the circuit, it's called the parabrachial nucleus, that is absolutely species specific in terms of its electrical excitability, and it determines the rhythm of the song. So we're hot on the trail of the genes that are present in that neuron that give each species their specific songs.
Here are two questions that's sort of related, and then I'm going to write the rest of them down and we can come back to them at the end. But one is that from Adi Laflamme, could you please clarify how you define music versus sound? And then Maya Weissenhaus asks, could you speak more on the evidence of language emerging from music? So,
okay. So music is, so the question is, if you're not a human, what does music mean to you? Does the nightingale appreciate when it sings? Or actually, it turns out the fairy wren is the one with the most beautiful music. Is that particular aesthetic quality that we feel appreciated by the animals? I would argue strenuously that the emotional quality is there. And then you could argue that the emotional quality gave rise to the aesthetic appreciation. Okay, that's one way you could go with that answer. But short of learning the language of the frogs and the songbirds, it's going to be very difficult to answer that question. I'm kind of convinced that it's an inadvertent, the musical qualities of bird songs, for example, are really an inadvertent but highly evolutionarily selected feature of their vocal organs. In a bird, it's both the larynx, which allows airflow, and the syrinx, which is a special song organ. So it's very much in the periphery. Whether they would adjust it when it went out of tune, that would be, are they tone deaf songbirds? Probably not. So it's really a question to answer.
One last one from Virginia Rao. Is there any evidence, I know there is, that these frog songs are evolving or have evolved differently in different locations?
Yeah, it's
short-term evolution or long-term evolution.
Well, so it's this very old frog, ancient frog, and there are species throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And each one of those species has a characteristic song from song frequencies and from the pattern. So I don't have any recent evolutionary example of frog songs evolving, but what we're doing in the lab now is crossing two different species, one from South Africa and one from the Congo, and crossing the crosses in order to identify regions of the genome coming from their moms or dads that contribute both to the spectral features of their song, the sound pitches or frequencies, and to the temporal frequencies. And that's actually something I'm doing in collaboration with Andres Bendeski and Young-Mi Kwan here at the Zuckerman Institute.
Great. I'm going to save Sam Shacker and Mike Shadlin's comments till later. I think everyone can see the questions, and Mia Chiquier on whether frog songs have rhythm. Maybe you could quickly answer that one, Darcy, and then we'll come back to Mike and Sam.
Yeah, they do have these rhythms. They're either biphasic, or they're a little burst, or they're a single pulse of sound, which I'm not very good at doing, but it's really a very, very brief sound pulse given at regular rhythms. While we hear the other ones, I'll dig up a few examples of these to play later on in our discussion.
Okay, yes. And now we'll go to Mickey Goldberg. Thank you, Darcy. It was fabulous. So Darcy, stop sharing, I guess, or you have started sharing. Yeah.
I think I've stopped sharing.
Yeah.
Already.
Mickey, you have to share.
Mickey, you're muted.
Okay, so I think, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, now, yeah.
You can see, can you see the screen and the big idealized picture of the Zuckerman Brain Institute? So I'm a neuroscientist and a clinical neurologist. I've spent my neuroscience life studying vision, and specifically the cognitive aspects of vision, things like attention and spatial perception and visual motor association, using vision and eye movements as a way to look at complicated cognitive questions. And music is my hobby. One of the extraordinarily important part of my life. We were lucky enough to know before the pandemic a lot of freelance musicians, and they would rehearse in our living room and sometimes give these wonderful chamber music concerts. If they're going to have an important concert next week, they'll run it through 40 or so enthusiastic people at Camp Goldberg, and a dog. And I've been impressed at how important music is to Labrador retrievers who are used to listening to it. So I firmly believe that dogs understand music, and they understood, for example, the cadence that ends music, and then they would get up and take a bow. Okay, so somebody, oh, come on. So what is music? I asked the Oxford English Dictionary, and they said the art or science of combining vocal or instrumental sounds to produce beauty of form, harmony, melody, rhythm, or expressive content. And a 19th century version of the Encyclopedia Britannica said, music is that one of the fine arts which appropriates the phenomena of sound to the purposes of poetry. Now, to create an aesthetic out of sound, music imposes two dimensions on the myriad of different frequencies that clutter the aural environment, and one is pitch. Ooh, and from 20 to well above 4,000 hertz, but also rhythm. And rhythm is a regular temporal relationship among sonic transients. And what we call music is a combination of these two different ways in which the brain can sort the sonic environment. Now, we don't know as much about brain mechanisms of music as we do about speech, although I'm glad people like Matt are working on it. So let's start with speech. Language is the arbitrary assignment of sounds or symbols to things, actions, and concepts. So consider the word for the bird that quacks, duck, is ente in German, canard in French, âtre in Italian, three entirely different sonic entities. And so that says that language is this incredible abstraction. And each sound is entirely unrelated to the object it represents. So a little bit about neuroscience pathways. And so auditory processing enters the cerebral cortex. This is the cerebral cortex of a human. And this is the occipital lobe that does vision, and the temporal lobe that does lots of stuff, and the frontal lobe that does planning, and the parietal cortex that does vision for action, sensation for action and attention. So, but the top of the temporal lobe is the primary auditory cortex. And then it's surrounded by a number of and it gets information from the auditory thalamus, the medial geniculate body, and then passes it on first to a number of auditory association areas, one of which is Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is a critical speech area which makes those and maintains those associations between arbitrary sounds and arbitrary symbols and concepts. And so now, Wernicke's area talks to Broca's area, which is in the frontal cortex, and Broca's area produces the symbols for communication. And the classic Wernicke's patients have well-formed speech that makes no sense. Broca's area patients classically can understand almost everything, but can't communicate. Okay, so that's speech. But there's also effective communication. And this is very interesting because I think it provides some questioning about whether or not language, that is to say, arbitrary associations between sounds and concepts, evolved from, music evolved from language. Because humans can communicate emotion without words. So I can say in a neutral way, the boy went to the store, but I can say the same thing in an enthusiastic way, and you could catch my enthusiasm. The boy went to the store. And so above and beyond verbal communication, there's nonverbal communication, which is entirely different from language. So this is an example of that.
Ik ga helemaal geen kans op. Nou, kom erop, ja, kom erop.
Hey, gast, zit relaxed, man.
Wat zeg jij?
Now, you don't need to understand Russian to understand that the guy was very angry at the flight attendant. And it turns out that there is a clinical entity that you see after certain strokes that's called affective aprosodia. So, but this is in the right hemisphere, not in the left hemisphere. And some right temporal patients occasionally have difficulty identifying emotion in speech or in pictures. And right frontal patients occasionally have difficulty generating effective speech, but relay all speech in the same monotone. And stroke-induced amusia overlaps the damaged area in stroke-induced aprosodia. So this was a study from actually Finland, Sivonen et al., who studied a large number of patients who had this acquired amusia. And it turned out that the great number of the patients had lesions in that same temporal lobe area in the right hemisphere that causes and generates language in the left hemisphere. And so this is the sagittal view of that. And so the question is whether or not music came not from the arbitrary assignment aspects of speech, or whether or not it came from nonverbal communication. And I think that's a really interesting question. Now, it turns out that the representation of rhythm and pitch as measured by the Montreal Music Test overlap. So blue is scale and tone, and purple is rhythm, and there's significant overlap. Now, one critical difference between vision and speech is that speech and music require holding information in memory for a while before being able to analyze it. Now, vision is very good at getting the gist of a rapidly presented image. So I'm going to show you something very quickly. And presumably, you all saw what it was, did you? Yeah, it was a lion. Now, one thing is that well-learned musical pieces can be identified by their rhythms alone. So I'm going to tap something out. And you know what that is, even though Chris and Carol know different words to that. I hope. God Save the King or Queen, and my vis-a-vis. Another one that everybody knows is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But as Darcy and Matt said, music and emotion are tightly interlocked, which you would expect if music developed from nonverbal communication. So this is an example of a wonderful, cheerful piece of music. It's the D major toccata, and specifically the jig from it. And I think most people familiar with Western music would sort of get the joy and the happiness and the enthusiasm out of that piece. But consider this, consider this, it's an excerpt from Purcell's Dido and Aeneas. Dido is about to kill herself. And she says, when I am laid in earth, don't blame me, but remember me. You could feel, even from listening to the ground bass alone without the words, how ineffably sad that is. But I would like to argue also that music can be entirely abstract. I think a great example of this is a series of pieces called The Musical Offering by Bach. Bach was invited by Frederick the Great to come to Potsdam, and he was getting out of the carriage, and Frederick the Great said, let me show you a cool tune. I want you to improvise it. And so Bach went to the harpsichord. And this is Frederick the Great's tune and the beginning of Bach's fugue on it. Which is this wonderful abstract structure, but it would be very hard to put an emotion on it. Now, in order for the brain to perceive, let alone create, it has to solve a number of problems. It has to organize pitch and rhythm independently. It has to maintain both in a working memory scratch pad until the music becomes identifiable. It has to remember and identify acoustic patterns. It has to identify the emotion in music, probably with the help of the amygdala. And to do this, it uses many of the same right hemisphere structures that identify emotion in speech without language in order to process music. Thank you.
Mickey, very illuminating. Thank you. Questions from the audience? One has come in from Cynthia. Is there a way to measure the different physical effect on the brain of music in major keys versus minor keys that correlate to that same physical measure of sadness or joy? Forgive me, I'm not in the sciences at all, but I love music. It's one for you, Mickey.
So I don't know much about it.
Or maybe Matthew.
But I would imagine that there's a way to measure it. Monkeys, unfortunately, are not very auditory. And do monkeys understand? I don't know if anybody taught a monkey to differentiate between a C major chord and an A minor chord, or just a C major and a C minor chord. Now, the physical, there's a pretty good, but not by no means perfect, correlation between major keys and happiness and minor keys and sadness. But the musical offering theme is in a minor key, and you would never think it's sad. Do you think it's sad? I mean, I never did. And the Art of the Fugue is in major, and it's also abstract. So I think that there's a kind of overlap, but by no means a one-to-one correspondence between minor sad and major happy.
Sam Shacker asks, does the emotion evoked in a remembered piece have the same properties and activate the same brain regions as the same emotional valence evoked by a novel piece? Maybe Matthew can also weigh in on this.
That's for Matthew. I mean, I have no idea about that.
There is some work on that. I guess I'm not sure if the question means if you are remembering a piece, like imagining it, or if you're listening to a piece that you are familiar with. I'm not sure which one they're referring to, but I mean, for most of my research, it's very hard to know what is driving the emotional response if you're using pieces of music that you're familiar with. So I try to avoid that completely. Part of the reason why I have composers write me a piece of music or I use unfamiliar music is to get away from any sort of extra musical confounds. Yeah, a familiar piece, right, a familiar piece with a novel piece, yes. There is work on that, and the emotional response tends to be much stronger for a familiar piece in both behavior and then brain regions. And so, yeah, like I was saying, I typically try to either control for one of those two things.
Great. Let's see. Jim Goldman, even abstract pieces that Mickey illustrates, can evoke strong emotions in the sense that listeners consider it wonderful. What does that mean, Mickey?
Well, I don't know. Do you get your pleasure from just the abstract structure? That, you know, considering something is wonderful, you know, really, really good. Broadway boogie woogie, right? Wonderful. But is it fit on an emotionally valent line? I don't know. I would guess not. I think there's something about the pleasure of structure, and abstract music is hard. Abstract, tonal, following the rules music is somehow harder to learn to love than emotionally valent music.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Maybe we should leave this toward the end, but let's bring it up now. Mike Shadlin says, assuming the amygdala is recruited when we experience happiness, fear, sadness, etc., what does this have to do with the process of experiencing music in the way that leads to happiness, fearfulness, sadness? And Matthew says that perhaps the patterns of activation of the amygdala don't have anything to do with it. It's the communication between the amygdala activation and other regions in the insula and prefrontal cortex that, anyway, now we're getting into a zone that perhaps we should let Mariusz talk first and then get into the zone with Cynthia says, what does the amygdala have to do with critics' taste? Anyway, let's come back to that question and go on to Mariusz now. Mariusz Kozak, who's from the Department of Music, and he's going to tell us about the challenges of bringing together these various disciplines. Thank you, Mickey. Are you muted, Mariusz?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you to Chris and Carol for organizing this seed sowing discussion, and also to the other panelists for sharing their expertise. I'm here to contribute a musicological perspective. And what I want to do is focus on some aspects of this object that we're considering here. And perhaps pose some questions that may serve as opportunities to start a conversation that will bridge some ideas between the humanities and neuroscience. So the concept of music, as Mickey already suggested and explored, evokes a seemingly inexhaustible number of associations. But most of us will probably agree that it refers to some kind of organization of sound, whether by human, animal, or increasingly artificial intelligence. And if I played for you something like this, and then ask you, what are we doing? You'd probably answer, we're listening to music. So I want to frame my brief discussion around this statement, we're listening to music, and examine the kinds of challenges posed by each one of the terms. Let's start with music itself. The question of what we mean by music is a tricky one, even if we set aside the fact that many cultures around the world don't distinguish between what we call music and other activities, such as dance, ritual, or play. Even if we stay within the realm of Western enculturated listeners, what makes a sequence of sounds music is not easy to pinpoint. For many listeners, the sequence must satisfy certain conditions. For example, it has to feature different pitches organized into a melody, and it has to have a certain temporal regularity. The music psychologist Diana Deutsch and her colleagues have illustrated this with what they call a speech-to-song illusion. Let me play it for you first.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely, 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 sometimes behave so strangely.
Okay, so I think you get the point. And what this shows is that just by changing the temporal nature of the sound, one can bring out features that many listeners will recognize as musical, even if we're not really talking about music proper here. Lisa Margulis has recently shown that the same effect can be achieved with non-speech sounds. Of course, over the last 100 years or so, composers have challenged this notion that music must have recognizable pitches organized in an orderly manner. John Cage's experiments with silence, or rather its lack, are one extreme example of this, but many composers today incorporate noise into their pieces. Indeed, the category of noise seems to be mostly discursive. Noise is sound that is an unintended byproduct of some other process. Noise signifies or points to something outside of sound itself. For example, the sound of a leaf blower signifies someone clearing out leaves. In contrast, music is sound that signifies or points to itself. So in principle, you could listen to a leaf blower just for the sake of the sound's intrinsic qualities. You could, in other words, listen to it as music, although I doubt many people would willingly do that. But we don't even have to be that fanciful. We don't have to be avant-gardists. Let's say I were to play for you something like this. If you don't know this piece, you might think, oh, it sounds pretty, or it relaxes me, or it's played on guitar, which reminds me of this other guitar piece I heard the other day. If you do know the piece, you'll recognize it as a guitar arrangement of the Flower Duet from the opera Lakme by Delibes, originally performed by soprano and alto. However, if you've ever been on call with the British Airways with their customer service for any reason in the last few years, you'll recognize it as the British Airways hold music. And if your experience was anything like mine and you sat there waiting for over an hour before somebody on the other end finally picked up, you would most definitely not consider this to be a pretty relaxing piece of music. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is with these examples is that the very same sounds can be appreciated in different ways, from very utilitarian to aesthetic, from noise to music. And so the question is this: what makes the same sound musical in one context and non-musical in another? That is to say, what does it mean to listen to sounds aesthetically, to listen to sounds as music? Next, let me examine the notion of listening. Most of us would probably agree that music requires sound to distinguish it from other arts. And even if listening is a multimodal process that includes vision, kinesthesis, and perhaps even haptics, most of us would also agree that audition is the primary mode of perceiving sounds. But what if things were a bit more radical than that? What if music perception did not involve audition at all? And what if music itself didn't require sound? I'm thinking in particular about the function of music for those who are deaf and what their experiences can tell us about the nature of music. Sound, including music, is a big component of the experience of the deaf because sounds engender responses of those who are in its vicinity. For an artist, Christine's son Kim, who is congenitally deaf, the perception of sound is thus the perception of others' responses to sound. People respond to sound, and she responds to people. Sound is as much a part of Kim's world as it is a part of the world of hearing individuals. For example, when she was a girl, she would be told not to chew with her mouth open, or not to slam the door, or not to scrape her fork on the plate because it's aggravating to those around her. Kim explores her relationship with sound in general, and with music in particular, in her art, including her 2013 piece called Face Opera 2. In the fragment I'm going to show you, which comes from Act 1, we see a choir made up of prelingually deaf performers. Kim, seated with a tablet, shows a series of concepts to a conductor who communicates these concepts to the performers, who then respond with facial gestures, but without using their hands. The idea here is for the audience to hear the musicality of the facial expressions used in American Sign Language without the accompanying manual hand shapes. These facial expressions are critical to sign language because they both contextualize hand shapes and constitute the signer's personal voice. What Kim is doing with this opera then is to challenge our conception of music by radically crystallizing musicality into bodily gestures divorced from any sonic reality. The final term I want to turn to is we. Specifically, with the problems of music and listening as a backdrop, I want to think of music as a kind of behavior, or following some comments made recently by the jazz pianist Vijay Iyer, as an enactment of a particular kind of sociality and intimacy. A typical musical paradigm conceives of musical interactions as essentially dyadic, occurring along a single information channel. In this model, there's a sender, someone or something that creates music, or more generally, something that is recognizable as music within the context in which it's taking place, and the receiver, listener, or again, more generally, someone who interprets the signal as music. The interactions between the sender and the receiver may be unidirectional or multidirectional, but the point remains that whether one is interested in the performer or the listener, the perception of music takes place at the level of the individual in relation to the sound, or signal in general. Yet the process of distilling music down to its essentials suggests that music is not reducible to any specific phenomenon, be it sonic or otherwise, but is instead a form of behavior. In fact, in my own work, I posit that music is a kind of socio-cognitive prosthesis. In other words, it's a technological enhancement of the body's temporal capabilities deployed in order to emotionally connect with other human beings. This reframing of the concept of music widens our lens to the level of population, but it does that in a particular way. Rather than thinking of music as a signal that is sent from the sender to a number of receivers, what it is really is the interaction between and among multiple senders and receivers. The individual in this scenario is not a recipient of the signal, but a node in a network that encompasses other individuals that together make up a particular social group. The individual constitutes music by focusing the signal, but then enacts an understanding of the signal as music in order to communicate and commune with other members of the group. This understanding changes depending on the situation. For example, when we jump along with the beat at a rock concert or sit still and quiet while listening to Mahler at the Neuroscience. To listen to music is at heart to signal to our conspecifics that we are, in fact, listening to music. That is, that we're listening aesthetically, as opposed to listening to sounds specifying something external to themselves. Just as with other kinds of behavior, conventions and prescriptions normalized by our social groups enable and constrain the actions that we can take. So whatever actions we do perform signal to others that we are part of the community. And to return to the initial statement, we're listening to music. What it articulates is not some fact about an objective reality, about a precisely determined or even determinable phenomenon, but rather a renewal of a commitment to the social groups to which we belong. I think going forward, this is what makes the study of perception and neuroscience of music such an exciting opportunity, because it taps into something fundamental about our humanity, about what and who we are. Thank you.
Excellent coda to this discussion. Great. Let's see. Raphael Garrity, who's another PSSN scholar. Matt, to follow up on Mike's question, this is now for Matt. What would PFC or insula-amygdala communication have to do with experiencing music in a way that leads to a particular emotion?
So I would talk about, let's take the insula as a better example. So I think the way that the insula functioning is typically thought of in the world of emotions is that it's representing the experience of an emotion. So the bodily state changes, the mental state changes that accompany some change in the environment that signals an emotion. So theoretically, my understanding would be that the amygdala would be signaling some aspect of the environment that's changing that is then felt or experienced subjectively by patterns of activity in the insula. that would be kind of the way that I would think about it.
Great. Okay, this is Pamela Smith asking Mariusz, can frogs make music? I want to hear you and Darcy talk about this. Darcy a little bit touched on this, but Mariusz.
So I used to be squarely—
By your definitions.
I used to be squarely in the camp that animals don't have music. But I'm slowly coming around, particularly with the work that Julia Bruno has done, one of the other PSSN scholars, on zebra finches. And I don't know enough about frogs to say whether or not they do, but based on my sort of understanding of human music, one of the requirements is that the sounds are perceived as being significant in and of themselves. So in other words, they don't have to communicate anything, and they're used solely as a way of focusing a group, a community, in order to create these emotional bonds between the members. But I don't know if maybe Darcy wanted to.
Yeah, Darcy.
Counterpoint.
Well, of course, I mean, there are a couple differences here. One is that large chunks of music are learned. So for example, a perfect fourth, which is what the frog that I illustrated is producing, is a harmonic interval in some, for some people, and for other systems of music is not regarded as euphonious. And so there's these intrinsic qualities of music that can be arbitrarily ascribed to particular relationships between pitches, which is kind of interesting. And I assume that that's cultural, that somebody who was brought up in that culture, even though they came originally from another culture with a different musical tradition, would adopt the characteristics of that culture. So there's learning. But I suspect that there is a very strong innate component to music, the way we experience it. And I think part of that innate component is the part that comes through this connection to the systems, the physiological systems within the body that respond to stimuli that are fearful or enjoyable. All of these things get filtered through the brain just as not, I wouldn't say as cognitive, but as tone, and get expressed in physiology as well. So there's a big literature on what's the basis for that. When you hear something that you absolutely adore and you get the shivers, for me, it's mostly human voice actually that gives the shivers. What is that? What's going on in the brain during the production of that shivery emotion? So I think large chunks of it are in fact part of this very ancient system and tied to physiology. And then large chunks of it, because we're very cognitive animals, are tied to cognition. There's just no doubt about it. And then of course there are languages that use musical qualities in language to convey meaning. And that's an interesting feature in and of itself. I think I have been drawn to studying sound and vocal communication because of the strong importance of what I think of as a musical quality in human voice. So voice is important to us. We always think of ourselves as looking at somebody to see how they feel about us, but no. You can tell from somebody's voice whether they're totally pissed off at you or not, right? And so these more subtle qualities that are present in language are incredibly important for social interactions. And there's a very interesting theory by Dorothy Cheney, unfortunately the late Dorothy Cheney, and Bob Seyfarth, that the origin of language was actually in these kinds of social communications using sounds. And they came across that from a really interesting study of a troop of baboons that we could talk about. So while I think that for us, music has these very strong cognitive qualities, and I have to say that Ursula, who discovered this thing for me, is an electronic music composer from your department, and her music does not evoke in me the same extraordinary pleasure as Bach. But eventually I'm pretty sure I could get it and come to some great enjoyment of it. So I think learning is a big chunk of what discriminates these things. but that we still have these very ancient parts that are involved. That's
so fantastic. We have two questions on collective or cooperative music production and then collective hearing, one from me. But I wanted Sam Shacker asked this much earlier and he's repeated it. Appreciation of music first evolved in a social context in combination with multimodal sensory stimuli. How does simply listening to music produce the full naturalistic and contextual features reminiscent of early exposure to music? Mariusz.
I'm sorry, I seem to have cut out, but
At 5:56, Sam Shacker asked the question, or anyone else can pitch in. Mickey or... So how do we, when we simply listen to music, how do we, I guess what he means is, maybe Sam, are you there? Maybe you could embellish on your question.
maybe this would be for Matt.
Yeah, or Matt.
Possible to unmute yourself? I mean,
Yes.
Oh, okay. What I was trying to get at is that, you know, our music appreciation, our music capabilities evolve not just, you know, people whistling to themselves, but in a social context that typically involved either some ritual or some other emotional feature. And it was done in a social context. So when you do your experiments in an fMRI machine, and you call this naturalistic, I'm not quite sure I understand what the word naturalistic means in this context.
This is definitely for Matt.
Yeah. So that was exactly my point of my talk. So maybe I didn't convey this particularly well, which is that the term is misleading for precisely that reason. It's a term that's used in the neuroscience community, not so much with musicians, to just kind of talk about anything that is like unmodified. But you're exactly right. There is a huge component of music listening, and particularly music listening in a scanner, that is very unnaturalistic. So I try to not use that anymore, but to focus on what we can and cannot learn from music listening in an isolated situation like fMRI. Now, there are people that are trying to do group listening with different types of neuroimaging techniques, not fMRI, but they're called hyperscanning, which I didn't really get to, which is multiple people listening to something at the same time or playing something at the same time, which might get more at that social component. But I mean, if your question more broadly is how is music listening social if you're doing it by yourself, I think it actually can be social, and it's because of the associations we have and the experiences we have, and you're feeling connected to the composer, whether or not you're right in front of them or whether or not you're dancing to it. I still think there can be a smaller social component to that that's learned over time.
Speaking of that, so Nick Gallerani, who's a student of neuroscience, medical center, and also a musician, I believe, he says, do animals ever produce music cooperatively? Or is music in the animal kingdom purely a competitive thing? I think he means using for mating, life and death, and so on and so forth. And I was going to ask Mariusz, I loved your social, your last diagram. And how did audiences evolve? How did the idea of listening to music collectively evolve? Is that a recent thing? Mickey, maybe you know.
To listen collectively?
Yeah.
No, I think that's to listen individually is a very recent thing. I mean, if we think about it, for much of human history, listening to music required the presence of other human bodies, other human beings, unless you were just singing to yourself or tapping or whatever. Even simple dyadic interaction between the mother and an infant, that's already a social kind of interaction. But what I wanted to sort of pick up on is and I think Mickey actually asked a similar question, and Matt as well, is this idea that that music is something separable from all of these other aesthetic experiences, which include other human beings, and which, as I think, as I claim, produce sort of this kind of collective knowledge about the object, but also about each other living in a community. And it's that, we are, so Mickey asks whether this, the face opera would be better understood as a dance than as music. I think what all of this is pointing towards is that the separation that we make, and by we, I mean sort of Western scientists, humanists, academics, listeners, between music and other art forms is artificial itself. And that what these new forms of music and art in general are pointing towards is a kind of relinking them in some way, so that the sonic is not separate from the visual and is not separate from the kinesthetic, and is not separate from the haptic.
And back to Nick's question, I think, Darcy, you can embellish this. Yes, animals do make music and used socially for other social interactions. And the PSN scholar just referred to, Julia Bruno, is studying this in zebrafinch song, and how it's used in a social context. Mostly biologists study individual animals, just like we study individual humans in fMRI. Darcy, would you? Yeah.
Well, it's long been known that birds duet. And there's a very good example of a wren in South America where a famous British ornithologist listened to the song and thought it was a lovely male song, and it turned out to be a duet between a male and a female, the assumption being the female wouldn't sing. The male song is learned and the female song is innate. So that's a very, and that's given by pair bonded animals. Sometimes duets are vocal battles, kind of like rapping duels. That's true in Xenopus, the animal I work on. There are choruses of frogs that synchronize sometimes, and sometimes only go in the pauses, the quiet pauses between it. So there's a lot of cooperation in the animal world in the use of sound. And animals use sound either when they're nocturnal and vision isn't going to help, or when vision is impeded, if they happen to be a diurnal animal. Animals that are nocturnal, that make their living at night, make their living almost entirely through sound. I wanted to play you, if you'll, can I still do this? Can I share the screen? I guess not. Oh yeah, I can. I wanted just to play you to answer some of the earlier questions in the chat. I wanted to play you some examples of these songs. All right, so that's a click song. Let's see. Okay, that's a tick song. And those are all given by animals within the same group. And then I can just play that. This is the experiment we're doing now. So we're crossing these two species with different calls. Here's one. Make that louder. And this is the other species. Oh boy, that's soft. I have to do my amplitude adjustment. And then this is the hybrid between the two of them. And this is the auditory sensitivity to different frequencies. And actually the hybrid is most sensitive to the hybrid frequencies, which is a very interesting note. So the patterns are not inherited. The patterns are spread throughout the entire phylogenetic tree. So in any branch of the tree, you'll have individual clickers or bursters or drillers. But what does give genetic information is the information that's in the pitch. So closely related species can be picked apart, can be actually identified by the pitch of the two frequencies in the male song. And I can do it, and I suspect the frogs can do it as well.
There's Sam Norman Hagnera. Would you like to ask your question? Unmute yourself. Or I could read it. That there's pretty good evidence that there are human-specific neural representations of musical acoustics, though these may be learned. Are you there?
Yeah, hey. Yeah, I was just responding to some of the points that were raised above. So like, for example, like harmonicity and consonance, which I don't know, it's a pretty basic thing that you might think would be plausibly innate. There's now like pretty good evidence at this point that that's something that's learned and culturally specific. So for example, there are people with very, very little exposure to Western music. It's a population called the Chimane, and they pretty clearly don't exhibit preferences for like consonant versus dissonant intervals, even though they do exhibit preferences for sort of more basic types of acoustic features, like something called beating. And then the other point I was going to add is that a lot of my work has focused on the neural representation of musical acoustics. And so my work doesn't have that much to say about sort of higher level aspects of emotion, but we do know that sort of when you just get outside of primary auditory cortex in this sort of secondary area of the auditory brain, there are regions that respond pretty specifically to music, and they respond to higher order features that are not present in sort of standard lower level acoustic representations. And we now have some pretty good evidence that those regions aren't present in other animals. So for example, if you test ferrets in a very similar paradigm, or macaques, you don't see anything like that. It's just that there's some kind of, potentially learned, potentially innate representation of music that's developed through at least extensive amounts of exposure to Western music in humans.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Mike, you've been weighing in, Mike Shadlin, but now you're back. Would you like to ask or comment as you've written? Mike Shadlin, over there. Can't hear you.
Oh, there, I can.
Yes, okay, yeah.
This was really for Mariusz, but it's really for everyone, I guess. And it's, in a way, I'm checking whether I kind of hear your argument, Mariusz, which is when you emphasize the listening, I think it advances, I'm just reading my comments, and the structuralist argument that I heard or listened for in your presentation, because there's an implied promise of the way I see music, and I thought perhaps this would be an example of something that I could hear in what you were saying, and in the Deutsch example of an implied completion, or at least a contour, a sort of a direction of where we're going from here, and leading to all kinds of probably cultural versions of how we deal with that, question and answer, and so forth, dissonance and things like that. But the idea that is both imbued by the artist to the beholder in a communication in that forward direction, but also listened for by the listener or by the beholder. That's just general words. And but I think that what's beautiful about music, in a sense, or special about it, as you were saying, is that that's intrinsic to music. It doesn't have to be referential or programmatic, as they say in music. But I think it's that structuralist kind of argument allows us to see that music really has the same features as all other art, and I would just argue a celebration of what we do cognitively all the time when we complete a thought.
Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree. Yeah.
Okay, so I heard you right then. Good.
No, but what I wanted to say was that I really appreciate how you're kind of completing my thought here. Is that the artist exists and works within the community, and in many musical communities, the artists are themselves the listeners and the performers. And so there's so in jazz, for example, we have the creator and the performer, sort of the composer and the performer folded into one person, and everyone else also a listener as well. But there are lots of cultures in which there's no distinction between artists and listeners, and everyone kind of participates. Yeah, I think what I'm getting at is that this kind of mode of existence within the community is very much sort of, I don't know, it's like it's what art in the 21st century in Western context I think is heading towards by challenging these notions that music requires harmonicity, that it requires things like beat and meter, that music requires sound, that music requires human participation. So for example, the question is whether or not artificial intelligence can produce music or can understand music, or are they just making meaningless sounds for themselves, right? As far as they're concerned. And so I think art is, music in particular, it provides such a fertile ground for neuroscientific exploration, because we can start to get outside of these paradigms where a listener is listening to, Western derived harmonies or rhythms or whatever, and start thinking about the role of this in constructing communities, in constructing sort of social relations, rather than focusing on the phenomenon itself.
Great. I don't know if Lindsay Buckhurst is still here, but I wanted to get back to her question, which really everyone can address, but particularly Matthew. Let me get it. It's, maybe we should end with this, which is, Matthew, can you speak more about how you are discussing the perception of emotion or identifying what emotion is intended in music versus what emotions we experience while listening to music?
Yeah, so
it's appeared
typically
at 5 o'clock if you want to.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'll just speak on the way that I typically try to handle it, and just admitting that it is difficult to do. But the best that I have is to rely on a combination of self-report. So if you ask people both questions and then determine stimuli in which you find sort of the greatest differentiation between those two, then you can potentially use those as a way to disentangle one from the other. And then also the other way I would think about it is in terms of, and this might just be a little less based on empirical evidence, but if you're going to use things like pure sine tones or like very simple monophonic melodies or very, very short clips, it's very clear that those can still convey emotions very quickly, but I would argue that they're unlikely to actually induce an emotion. So you can kind of go about it based on the stimuli that you choose to use, and actually you would probably want to have people experience them and tell you how they feel, and making them aware of the fact that you can very much experience something that is different than what you perceive.
Right. Are you here, Lindsay Blackhurst? Did that answer your question? I don't know if she's still around, but quite late. Anyone else? Let's see. I think there was one that Maya.
I can respond to Ray if.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the last question is the strong magnetic field in MRI possibly modulating brain responding to music?
So I don't think it would be the magnetic field, but it's likely, and certainly that the pulse sequence, the radio frequencies, is loud and banging and definitely affects how people experience and listen to music, which is a huge problem. It's funny that you bring up among, because I've actually I collaborate with someone who has experienced meditators in the scanner, and they've actually mentioned how well they can actually get into that state during scanning. They're pretty able, not everyone obviously, but they are able to get into a meditative state during scanning. So it definitely is not the most naturalistic, and something we have to contend with. We have noise canceling headphones for this. Part of the reason I had composers write music was that we could match the tempo of the frequency of the pulse to the musical stimuli that we're using, so you don't have confluence there. But yeah, for sure, it's going to modulate brain activity in some way. Another thing you can do is something called sparse tempo sampling, where you actually turn off the scanner when you play the music and then turn it back on, which doesn't allow you to get certain temporal components, but might be one way of sort of dealing with this.
Yeah. Ray is a maven of the technicalities of the MRI. So Mike Shadlin, people who have to leave can leave, but Mike wants to answer Chris Peacock's question, which came in at 5:54. So Chris asks for Matt and anyone else who wants to jump in, the visual perception of the performer can make a massive difference on how we hear the music. What do you think this shows, and what's the right way of accommodating it theoretically this is for everyone, or Mickey could probably also address this too, but Mariusz and Matthew. Oh, Mike was gonna.
Okay, Mike, go first.
I can go first?
Yeah.
I'd like to answer it.
Okay,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
it's that, you know, all of knowledge is organized as an answer to an interrogation, Chris, as you well know. And so it's not really just simple representations and impressions and in the brain, but what we make of it in a sense, in some kind of intentional way. So when we listen to music at the concert hall, even from far away, and you see the second violinist's bows moving, you hear that part. I mean, partly because you have a little clue to hear it, you know, or the conductor gives away something to you. So I think that we listen with intention, and we can follow the train of a line that's inside of the other lines, and we do it differently. You can do it if you sit with a score and read that line while you're listening to something, or you can do it by seeing the performer, or seeing exactly when they hit their key on their horn or whatever, you know, and you begin to hear the note differently because it's an answer to kind of an interrogation that you've made with, thanks to something that was you know, triggered by another stimulation to the senses. So I think that's important to think about what we understand in accordance with the way we interrogate it. That's also could riff into why the musicians themselves are hearing things that their listeners don't necessarily hear. I do want to say one last thing though, because I didn't get a chance to say it, which is that I had a comment that I put in, but it was only 3 minutes into the discussion.
Repeat it.
It was
I
at
forgot about that.
4:33. That's why.
Do you want to let me?
Oh, such a good joke. It was such a good joke.
So I think that the idea of interacting with the musician is very interesting. And one of the things that the COVID has made me think about is the fact that live performances, even Zoom live performances, feel different from film performances. When you're there and there's a kind of chance and a difference that it somehow feels different, and I don't quite understand. But I also want to raise the question of animals and music. You know, in the worst part of COVID, I was taking my musical dog out to the Sakura Park, and there was a young woman doing scales on the bandstand. And suddenly the dog started to pull on the leash. I really want to go there. And we got to the woman playing scales, and he stopped. And then the woman started to play the Bach Chaconne in D minor. And the two of us, Alistair and I, were absolutely delighted with this. He stayed absolutely still for the 15 minutes in which it took her to play it. And I'm sure that he has some way of understanding music that may not be particularly different from ours to some extent. And that's only an anecdote, but it was quite striking.
Great. One little question I wanted to address, and Darcy, maybe you can, actually, I would also like to know, when did that animal songs seem to be, wait, let me find it. Yeah, animals have such complicated seeming innate songs, and assuming these have central pattern generators, for those of you who are not brain scientists may not know what that means, but Darcy could perhaps explain it. How did these evolve? Or what might they have been evolved from? This is from Maya Weisenhaus, it's 609.
So in vertebrates, proximally, the evidence is pretty good that in the brain anyway, that they evolved from the central pattern generator circuits for breathing, but then modified. For example, there's a role of the forebrain in birds, right, which have learned song, and that modifies the central pattern generator, which is in their hindbrain. And in birds, that's not very well understood. It's very hard to study anything in the hindbrain because if you start to examine it too closely, breathing or heart rate or something gets affected, which is not good for the animal. So that's true, but there are lots of ways of making sound, as we know, right? I mean, we can make sound with instruments or drums or whatever, and insects stridulate, they move their wings together like that. Even birds use their feathers to make sound. Woodpeckers tap on the wood. So, you know, there's a further question that asks whether these things have a common origin or whether they evolved independently, which is actually a very interesting question. I like that idea. I think that the other central pattern generators that are used are those that are used for locomotion. So central pattern generators are a really important part of producing sound without an instrument. So from music and from breathing and also from the expression of emotion, from crying and laughing, which are innate behaviors, I think these things get roped into the production of a more complicated form of sound being used for creation.
Great. I think we could go on for hours this way, but I think people are starting to fade off. Just a last one for Matt, which gets at the amygdala. The amygdala turns out to be both a buzzword and maybe a trigger phrase. Actually, this is from someone called iPhone. How precisely have we localized various responses to music in the amygdala? And Matt answers. You want to answer, Matt, in person?
Sure. I'm not totally sure I understand the question or what they mean by localized, but if the idea is that
first responder, maybe first response. But
right. I would say that we have not then. Yeah. I mean, it's most studies with emotion or with music would show a diverse pattern of spatially distributed activity across the brain. And right. Yeah.
Good. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for just a fascinating gathering. If we were in the JLG building, we would probably be drinking wine and keep going on discussing. But I hope some of you can continue the conversation. And for Chris, it's now after midnight.
Thank you.
What's it? Chris?
Yeah, thank you very much. And we hope to have at least 2 more meetings this year, at least one of them on explanation in psychology and neuroscience and the relation between them.
Yes, and actually, Matt is actually moderating an event on, this is a shout out for his own PSs and Scholars actually put together a little symposia, again on how music moves us, exploring the connection between music and emotions on November 9th. I think it's at 2 o'clock. And also in the Zuckerman, Helen Sung, who's one of our artists in residence last year, is having a conversation at 2 o'clock somehow this week, and I forgot to mention the day, with someone who's worked with Nima Mesgarani on the brain and how it responds to music. So that's in the Zuckerman Weekly Digest this week. So if anyone wants to know more, just email me. Great, thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone.